On a recent pilgrimage to the Holy Land, I had the opportunity to spend 3 nights on the Mount of the Beatitudes. It is an amazingly prayerful place, perched high on a hill in Galilee. As you walk around that holy ground, you know that very near to where you're standing, Jesus first preached his Sermon on the Mount, proclaiming the good news of God's mercy. And as you look east from the Mount of the Beatitudes, you see the Sea of Galilee. It is a freshwater lake which is fed by the Jordan River, which flows down from the north. The Sea of Galilee is full of life. After all, the first disciples of Jesus fished in those waters, and people still fish there today. And the fresh water of the Sea of Galilee is used to irrigate the farms and fields of modern Israel. The waters flow in from the Jordan at the north end of the lake, and then they flow out at the other end, where the Jordan River continues. If you follow the Jordan River further south, you go down to that place where the Jordan once again flows into a large lake. This one is called the Dead Sea. The fresh waters of the Jordan flow into the Dead Sea, but absolutely nothing can live there. There's too much salt there. There are too many minerals there. Literally, nothing can live in that water, which is, frankly, a little confusing at first because it's the same water which supported so much life up at the Sea of Galilee. But there's one big difference between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. At the Sea of Galilee, fresh water flows in, and then fresh water flows out. It receives the life-giving gift of fresh water from the Jordan River, and that life-giving water flows out again. But down at the Dead Sea, the life-giving water flows in, but it never goes anywhere. The Dead Sea does nothing but receive. It never gives. Whatever water comes into it, the Dead Sea tries to hold on to it. It never flows anywhere. And as the water evaporates in the harsh desert sun, it leaves behind salt and minerals. And since nothing ever flows out of the Dead Sea, the salt and the minerals just have kept building up century after century until the water has become so poisonous that nothing can live there. The Sea of Galilee receives and then gives, and there's so much life. The Dead Sea receives and holds on. Nothing ever flows from it. There is no life. Frankly, what's true for those 2 seas in the Holy Land is true for the human soul. I'm sure you know people who have been richly blessed by God. And these people know innately that every gift that has been given to them should be shared with others. That's the pattern of their lives. They receive and they give. And because they do that, they are full of life and love and mercy, and the people around them share life and love and mercy. But some other people believe that the goal of life is to receive but never give, to take and then hold on. And eventually they become lifeless. Their spirits shrivel. If all you do is receive, eventually you become like the Dead Sea. In the 4 previous sessions, we've explored who God is, what God's mercy means, and how we experience God's mercy through Jesus Christ, and how we can experience Christ's mercy more deeply in this special Holy Year of mercy. We've come to see that God's mercy is an amazing gift, freely given to those who will show up and receive it. But Pope Francis has made it very clear that this Holy Year of Mercy cannot be a self-centered attempt to simply receive more and more of God's mercy for myself. Pope Francis calls us to understand that every time we receive God's mercy, we have a responsibility to give mercy to others. He warns us against any kind of piety that is focused solely on me and Jesus. If I only want to receive God's mercy without being willing to give mercy to others, then I will become like the Dead Sea. But if I understand that my baptism calls me to become an instrument of God's mercy in the world, then, like the Sea of Galilee, I will flourish, and those around me will experience life through Christ. Pope Francis wants all individuals, and in fact the whole church, to become the mercy of Christ. There is a parable which helps to explain this call. Listen as I read these words of Jesus from the 10th chapter of Luke's Gospel, beginning at the 29th verse. Jesus said, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped him and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, 'Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back.' Then Jesus asked, 'Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim?' And the man answered, 'The one who treated him with mercy.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go and do likewise.'" Now, when I read this parable, the first thing I'm tempted to say is this: it was his own dumb fault. Everyone knew that the road from Jericho to Jerusalem was dangerous. Smart people avoided the road, especially at night. Lonesome travelers on that road became a prime target for the robbers who hid in the hills all along the way. But this guy was by himself. He was asking for trouble. He was all alone on that Jericho road. No wonder he was robbed and beaten. It was his own dumb fault. Walking alone on that Jericho road would be like walking alone in certain parts of any major American city late at night. Walking alone on that Jericho road would be as dumb as going to a Washington Redskins game wearing a Dallas Cowboys jersey. Walking the road that ran from Jerusalem to Jericho, was a risky venture. So could you blame people for looking at the beaten-up guy on the side of the road and perhaps saying to themselves, "It's his own dumb fault"? Do we ever pass a similar judgment on other people who are suffering? Have you ever heard somebody say, "Well, he smoked for 50 years and now he has cancer, it's his own dumb fault"? Or have you ever heard somebody say, "Well, she cheated on her husband and now she's alone, it's her own dumb fault"? Have you ever heard somebody say, well, of course his life is ruined. He drank like a fish. Of course her life fell apart. She never went to church. She never contributed to the second collection. It's her own dumb fault. Many times, when confronted with human suffering, we do not respond by sharing God's mercy. We hold the mercy for ourselves, and instead of giving mercy to others, we pass judgment on them and on their circumstances. And we explain our behavior by saying, well, it's their own dumb fault. This attitude leads to spiritual death. So there he is, that man on the Jericho road, bleeding, robbed, and stripped, injured to the point that he cannot help himself. Sometimes when I read this parable, I identify with the Good Samaritan. I know how merciful God has been to me, and I understand how I need to notice my neighbors who are in need. And not just notice, I have to act, to help, to heal and be generous, to share mercy with them, to be neighbor to them. There are other people, however, with whom we might identify in this parable. Perhaps we identify with the priest and the Levite sometimes. They walked right by the man in the road. Maybe they were mumbling on their breath. It's his own dumb fault. Sometimes, quite frankly, I'm like that. And then there's the innkeeper who takes in the injured man and trusts that the Samaritan will pay the extra bill when he returns. Would you have trusted him without at least a credit card number? And sometimes in my life, I identify with the victim of the crime, the suffering one in need of mercy. There are times in life when we find ourselves in the middle of a mess that we've created. There are times in life when we've made bad choices, chosen a sinful, selfish, narcissistic way, and we end up in a dark or dangerous or lonely place saying to ourselves, how did I end up here? How did I get into this mess? This is my fault, and I can't fix it. When we're in those moments of suffering, we don't need a lecture. We need love and mercy. And along comes a Savior, and his name is Jesus. You see, Jesus never walks by ignoring our pain or leaving us hopeless. Jesus never abandons us along the side of life's road. He notices, he draws near, and he is filled with mercy. The only way we can ever become a good neighbor or become a good Samaritan for our brothers and sisters is when we understand that Jesus is willing to be the Good Samaritan and the Savior for us. He fills us with his mercy, the mercy that we need, so that we can become mercy for others. Pope Francis has been tireless in calling the church and every member of the church to become a merciful neighbor to all who are suffering in the world. And frankly, some people wish that he would stop talking about this. But this Pope is calling us back to the example of Jesus in the Gospels. Jesus always noticed those who were in need, those who were struggling, those in pain, and he acted with mercy. So must we. While some people wish that our church and faith and Catholicism would simply be a way for me to be blessed, for me to feel forgiven, for me to experience mercy and salvation, Jesus has the annoying habit of pointing out that every gift, including salvation, is given to us so that we can share it. Otherwise, we become like a Dead Sea. The Pope keeps talking about the people in our world who need to experience the saving mercy of Christ, and he asks us not to pass by, pretending that we didn't notice. Rather, the Pope keeps naming names. so that we must notice. The Pope is telling us that we must be merciful to the poor, that we must notice the poor. It's interesting to me. The English word mercy comes from a Latin word, misericordia. And that Latin word for mercy, misericordia, actually comes from two smaller words. Cor means heart, and misery means the poor. So the English word mercy comes from the Latin word which means someone who has a heart for the poor, someone who has a heart for the misery, the miserable, those who are suffering, those in need. The Pope says we must be a church for and of the poor. The Pope keeps saying that we have to notice the hungry and the frightened. We have to notice those who are feeling the pain of persecution. We have to notice those who are fleeing persecution, violence, and war. The Pope keeps saying that we have to notice immigrants on tottering ships, children trapped in human trafficking. We have to notice those who are hurting due to economic hardships. The Pope keeps saying that we have to notice women whose rights are often trampled. We have to notice minorities who cry out for justice. We have to notice gay and lesbian persons, divorced and remarried persons, persons who feel judged, wounded, abandoned, even by their church. The Pope keeps saying that we have to notice those who suffer due to depression or isolation or fear. And again, the Pope keeps speaking of the elderly, who in many cultures are cast aside and disrespected. And then, recently, in his encyclical letter, Laudato Si', the Pope also reminds us that all of God's creatures can suffer when we fail to properly care for God's creation. Being merciful is not an imposition or a burden. It is the opportunity for us to be more and more like Christ. And understanding that mercy is always tied to justice gives us an opportunity to witness to that justice which Christ died and rose to announce. For us, being merciful and just is an opportunity to generously share what has already been generously given to us. It's the opportunity to live in such a way that other people will look at us and see the truth of what Jesus said on that Mount of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful. Perhaps these reflections will help you as you ponder the following questions. Priests get some of the best phone calls. Several years ago, a man called the parish I was assigned to, and he announced in a slightly angry voice that he and his family were going to find another parish. I asked, "Why are you leaving our parish?" And he said, "This past Sunday, we sat down in our pew, and then some homeless guy sat down next to us. Why in the world would the ushers let a homeless guy into the building?" And then, he said, that first reader, that young woman, she had body piercings. Why in the world would you let that kind of girl read the holy word of God? And you, he said, you were the worst of all. I couldn't wait to hear the rest of this story. He said, "You said in your homily that gay and lesbian people are welcome in the church." "That's the last straw," he announced. Then he said to me, "I am not going to raise my children in a church where homeless people are welcome and body piercings are welcome and immoral people are welcome. So I'm going to take my family to a church where the truth is preached and sinners are not welcomed." And with that, he hung up. He was looking for a church where the truth is preached and sinners are not welcomed. I wonder what he does with the truth that Jesus preaches. The Jesus we meet in Luke's gospel, for instance, always speaks the truth. And he always seems to be quite comfortable in the presence of sinners. In fact, the truth is that the Jesus we meet in Luke's gospel seems to have a unique passion for those who are lost, for those who are broken, for those who have strayed, those who are judged by others. Listen to this brief parable from the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel, beginning at verse 9. Jesus then addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Jesus said, "Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself: 'O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income.' But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, 'O God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted." In this parable, we meet a tax collector who stands in a far corner of the temple, well aware of his own sinfulness. His prayer is brief, and it flows from a heart familiar with the brokenness of humanity. He prays, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." We also meet a Pharisee who proudly declares, "Thank God I am not like the rest of these slobs." He's not really praying to God at all, is he? He's congratulating himself. He's convinced that he doesn't need forgiveness because he has no sin in him. He is the right kind of people. Everyone else is the wrong kind of people. Which brings me back to the man who was taking his family away from the parish, since that congregation was full of all the wrong people. It seems to me that if we are going to be faithful to Jesus in this year of mercy, every parish has to be full of all the wrong people. That begins when you and I come to realize that we are all the wrong kind of people. Every one of us has been lost and found. Every one of us is a sinner, not yet fully a saint. We have strayed from the path of God and been brought home by the mercy of Jesus. Every person who goes to church has some aspect of their life that is not in conformity with the gospel. Every person needs God's mercy. We receive it, and we're called to share it. True worship begins when we acknowledge that fact. That's why we begin every Mass by saying or singing, "Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy." We need His mercy. We are all the wrong kind of people. Confronting our own sinfulness can make us uncomfortable. And then, to add to that discomfort, we must deal with the fact that Jesus still wants his church to be a place where sinners are welcomed. Jesus was very comfortable gathering with sinners and eating with them. Pope Francis has said that the Eucharist is not a reward for the perfect, but rather it is a medicine for those who are weak. Jesus always tells people the truth, and he called every sinner to conversion and growth in holiness. He called us to be people who work for justice. The church still needs to be that place where we speak the truth in love to one another and always encourage each other on the path to holiness and justice. If we are going to be faithful to Jesus, then we have to make that journey together as members of a church which is full of all the wrong kind of people. Pope Francis has caused many to rejoice with all his talk of mercy, but that same talk about mercy has made other people uncomfortable and even hostile. Which reminds me of something a seminary professor once said in class. He said, "The role of a prophet is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable." We human beings often like everything to be black or white. We like to easily and clearly define what's good and what's bad, who's in and who's out, who's holy and who's not. But Pope Francis keeps calling us to begin with a healthy sense of humility, admitting that we have strayed and we have needed mercy in powerful ways. And knowing that, Pope Francis calls us to leave the comfortable confines of our parish walls. He calls us to expand our horizons and to move beyond doing things the way we've always done things so that we can get out there to what he calls the margins, to the fringe, to places where human experience, where human life is messy and people are messy and mercy is both messy and marvelous. Why? Because that is where Jesus liked to be when he walked this earth. And that's where Jesus would like us to be right now. This kind of renewal will require some honesty on our part. We will have to examine how we act like that Pharisee in Luke's gospel who congratulates himself for being better than everybody else. And we will have to ask if there are still people in our lives or still people in our world whom we have judged to be the wrong kind of people, whom we have judged to be unworthy of God's mercy, unworthy of our attention and care. Perhaps in this year of mercy, we still have a lot of spiritual work to do, and the Holy Spirit will help us do it. Down in Argentina, there is a suburban church called San Jose. Every day, there is a steady stream of people going into that church. They go in, and almost immediately they turn to a side aisle to the left near the back. There, these people find a copy of an 18th century painting. The original is found in Germany. And it was there, in Germany, that a visitor from Argentina many years ago, whose name was Father Jorge Bergoglio, first saw that painting. Father Bergoglio was in Germany because his Jesuit superiors had sent him there. Officially, the explanation was that he was there to do a PhD. But the real reason was this. Father Bergoglio's leadership of the Jesuit community in Argentina had been so divisive and wounding for the community that the international head of the Jesuits had to take the extraordinary step of sending a superior from outside Argentina to begin the work of putting things back together. Bergoglio's leadership, his time as a superior of the Jesuits, had left the community in Argentina divided, and he felt defeated. The 50-year-old Father Bergoglio carried the weight of this sadness on his shoulders when he first saw that painting in Germany. The painting is called Mary, the Untied of Knots. It had been painted several centuries before to commemorate a healing experience that had happened between a man and woman in Bavaria. You see, that couple was married, and their marriage was in trouble. There were difficulties. There were differences. It looked like the marriage was going to fall apart and fail. There was great sadness in their hearts. To use an expression that we still use in modern English, that couple felt that they and their marriage were tied up in knots. And they also felt that nothing could untie those knots and restore their love and bring them healing. But the local priest told the husband to entrust his marriage, even the parts of his marriage that felt tied up in knots, to the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And that's what he did. And eventually the knots were untied, and the relationship was healed, and mercy filled their hearts. Perhaps that is why Father Bergoglio was drawn to this painting, Mary, the Untied of Knots. Maybe Bergoglio sensed that his life was tied up in knots, and that his sins and weaknesses and failures could not be undone or unraveled. But just a few months later, Father Bergoglio was back in Argentina, not in a position of power, but living with the poor and loving the poor and learning from the poor. And he talked to them about how God's mercy could begin to untie everything in this world that tries to bind us. How God's mercy can untie every knot that interferes with our experience of joy. Mary, the Untied of Knots, the one who intercedes so that all of God's children can experience mercy. Soon after Jorge Bergoglio was elected and took the name Pope Francis, a journalist asked him, "Tell us something about yourself. Who are you?" And Pope Francis replied, "I am a sinner upon whom God has looked with mercy." The knots of his life had been untied. Pope Francis received mercy, and he is sharing it with the world, and he's asking us to do the same. In this year of mercy, through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, may you come to know more clearly that you are a sinner upon whom God has looked with mercy. Then go, untie the knots in the lives of those who still yearn for freedom.